or you're listening to Ed Schultz and Tom Hartman. All the angst you feel either side of the thing you're listening to comes because you don't see that. And those guys don't see it. And by the way, they're all looking backwards, not forwards, in their understanding, because looking backwards is what keeps them going to the bank. And they're more interested in going to the bank than they are in anything else. And I don't say that condescendingly, because you like to go to the bank too, don't you? But you need to understand. You see, you have to back off and look and understand what's going on. And if believers don't do it, there ain't nobody doing it. So you got to get yourself in some kind of a control here. Talking about these seasonal things, I'm gonna I put my Bible aside over this so you could see. I'm going to talk to you about some things in relationship to what I tried to lay this out for you out of the Scripture. Now I want to talk about some of this stuff, and the things I'm going to talk about now. There are 4 books that I want to tell you about. I've told you about 2 of them before. Back in the late 90s, there were 2 very, very smart guys, I think. Frankly, a man by the name of William Strauss and Neil Howe. They wrote a book called The Generations. This is the single most helpful American history book you will ever read. Okay? I've read probably 200 American history books. This is the most helpful. If you don't read any other book about history, read this one. Now, this book you can buy it on eBay for $5. You can get it on Amazon for $25 or $15. It's called Generations: The History of America's Future, 1584 to 2069. These guys, they took this information out of Genesis 6 and applied it to history, not knowing they were doing it. These were not believers. They were writing from an academic viewpoint. I just happened, as life happens, little things, to see them interviewed by Brian Lamb on C-SPAN back in 97. And when I did that, maybe 96, and they were talking about this book, and then they were talking about their new book called The Fourth Turning. Now, if you want to read one of the 2, read The Fourth Turning. I take dust covers off of books when I use them. The Fourth Turning. This is an academic book. This is sort of a 10-year later, here's how it worked out kind of a book. This book right here it ought to be required reading so that you understand. So a lot of the things I'm going to put on the board up here in a few minutes, academically, you're going to learn from these things. What these guys did, when I first read the book, the first one I read was The Fourth Turning. You can look at it and see my notes in it. I see that's Genesis 8, and I go, that's a clear. And what they had the ability to do in their academic understanding, they knew enough about the details of American history to see the things that Genesis says are going to be there, the cyclical patterns. And when they laid them out, I'm scratching my head and say, wow. And it gives you an understanding of the times like you're not going to get from all this other stuff that comes along. Because although it isn't consciously biblically based, it's studying history from the way the Bible says you ought to study history in the cycles. Now, it's even better because they didn't know they were doing it. You understand that? They didn't have the preconceived idea that I need to go find this. They just studied history. And if you study history, what are you going to find? You're going to find what God put there if you do it honestly. Here is a book. Anything by Harry S. Dent, Jr. you should read if you're interested in economics. Harry Dent is an economist who takes these people's generational theories, ideas, and applies to economics. Now, the first thing people ask you when you say, well, winter's here, they say, well, what should I do with my 401k? Well, now that winter is here, your 401k is an 01k. He told you that was going to happen 10 years ago. He tells you when the crisis was going to come. It came the month he said it was going to come. He tells you how long it's going to last. He tells you the dead cat bounce the market's going through right now, what it's going to go to, then what it's going to go down to. I mean, you say, how can you do that? Because of the cycles of generational spending that these guys talk about and identify. This guy was smart enough to take that same idea and apply it to economics and to economy. If you take, for example, the baby boomer generation spending patterns and lay it over the Dow Jones Industrial Average for the same period, they match like 90%. It's spooky. That means you don't have any ability with government spending or private spending to affect things. They're going to happen. Listen, you can't stop winter from coming no matter how hard you rail against it, can you? You can't stop spring from coming no matter how hard you rail against it. The cycles of nature happen. Well, the cycles in an economy happen. If you don't know what the cycle is, and you think, well, this one is like the one in the 80s, so let's do what we did in the 80s to get out of it, and this one isn't like the one in the 80s, it's the one like in the last winter, and you don't even know when the last winter was, how would you know what to happen? In the last winter, they did exactly the same thing they're doing now. To stimulate the economy? Exactly. I mean, the details were different, but the big government spending. They did it for 10 years. When they started, the unemployment rate was 25%. When they got through with the 10 years, the unemployment rate was still 25%. You know, you look out there and you say, how much money did they give government motors not long ago? Billions and billions of dollars to keep them from going bankrupt, so now they say they got to go bankrupt. Well, couldn't we have saved that money? Well, no, because we had people we had to pay off. But, you know, that's another thing. You say, well, has it? It's never been done before. Oh, yeah, it has. Yeah, it has. Exactly. That's the reason I say they had people to pay off, because we now know that's what they were doing back then. This book's frightening. If you're interested in that, that isn't what I'm interested in. Okay, I'm not interested in telling you what to do with your money, if you got any. This guy will. I don't. The Great Depression Ahead, How to Prosper in the Crash Following the Greatest Boom in History. One of the things he talks about, you've got this great real estate bubble going down now. You've had that before. Had it in the last winter, had it in the winter before that. Did you know that the winter in the 1800s was there was a winter in the 1800s, and it was preceded by a bigger real estate boom and bubble than we've had now? And it burst the same way. You think this is the only time it's ever happened. You say, no, it happened back in the 80s. No, it didn't happen in the 80s like this one. This one was a winter time. The 80s was summer. Different kind of deal in summer and winter. But if you don't, my point is, that's a great book to read. Here's another one that I just read. This one is wild. You got to enjoy wildness for this one. It's called The Next 100 Years. This guy takes this man and that man's information and projects out what the next 100 years are going to be like. Now you got to appreciate a guy who guts enough to predict tomorrow, much less 100 years from now. And he talks about some things in here. This book is by I can't keep up with who writes things. I just read them. The Next 100 Years. Where's his name? It doesn't have a cover sheet. Got to have a page in here with his name on it. Oh, George Friedman, Friedman. And this book, and what he does when he starts, he says, I'm going to tell you what's going to happen for 20 years, and I'm going to be 60% right. Beyond that, it's a fool's guess. But I'm going to make some assumptions. It tells you what they are. Because, you see, if you can project out about 20 years, because that season is about a 20-year, see this span, 80 years, that's about 20 years. And you can kind of know what the season's going to be. You can know when it starts. You can know what's going to end it, but you can't know where it's going to be when it ends. Every winter doesn't end good. One winter in American history ended tragically bad, so bad that it screwed the whole system up. Every winter doesn't end good. But out of 6, if one went bad and the others were okay, that's not too bad a record. But with this guy, so he says, I'll tell you out 20 years, but then if this happens, it'll be that. If this happens, it's that. So I don't know which is going to happen. But this is a fascinating book to read. He tells you where the big wars in the next century, in the middle part of this century, are going to be. And if I told you where he says they are, you'd say, Brother Rick, this guy's nuts. What are you reading him for? You read the book, and you'll find out he's not quite as nuts as he thinks he is. But it's fascinating because all the trends that people think are important, and all the things you're worried about right now, what you discover is that they really aren't going to be the things that run life and make things go. Because what makes life happen is this cycle. So what you want to know, and the reason that cycle works is because there's spring, there's summer, there's fall, and there's winter. There's growth, maturity, entropy, death. You see that? And when we started, the last thing I said to you earlier was that it's the seasons of life, of people's life, that makes possible the creation of generations. And these are that makes these 4 generations or seasons in the culture. Because people, not just one person, but a whole group of people in this age bracket. We call them, they call them cohorts. In other words, this is this age bracket of people. And you understand, when you go to school, for example, you go to school with somebody basically your same age. You spend most of your time in this age bracket with people you're the same age. You start out this one in pretty much the same age category. It's not really until you get in this one that you begin to really expand out in your social network with people that are different ages. And then when you come here, you're back down to the same age group. So most of your life is practically spent in your cohort archetype. So you learn to react to things the way, take 9/11, for example. The way when 9/11, you remember where you were when 9/11 happened? How many ever remember where you were when Jimmy Buffett died? How about Elvis? I see you guys lying through your teeth. You're just sitting there trying to be more righteous than everybody else. How many ever remember where you were when John Kennedy died? Oh, okay. How many ever remember where Pearl Harbor? A few. Now, think about this. When 9/11 happened, if you were in this age group, would you have reacted to it differently than you were if you were in this age group? Sure you would. And if you were in this age group, would you have reacted to it differently than if you were in this age group? Yeah. If you're in this age group, it would have scared you because you see all the people around you afraid. If you're in this age group, what would you do? Well, I don't want them suckers hitting my country. Let's go join up. That's the people we send, isn't it? If you're here, these people manage things. And these people say, oh, boy, we remember when something like this happened before. But see, each group's going to respond to it differently. Now, this group and this group right here is the one's going to be the most impacted by it. Most of this group isn't going to notice it except just the turmoil around it. Because let's face it, till you're about 12, 15 years old, you don't know you're in the world, you don't know there's a world around you except where you live. But you come of age here, and you begin to test these values that you've been getting. And it's in this age group that you decide what value, and when that thing happens, it affects you the most. And it'll have the most impact in forming what happens to you the rest of your life. So you take this reaction here, this is a reactionary generation, and then you take that characteristic and move it through life, it's going to manage differently than this one did, these people did. It's going to remember differently than these people did. It's that which causes the turnings in the seasons. Because the cohort, this group here is who runs the world in these seasons. Okay? Now, if the people that are going through this season, this season of life, if that's changing, this year it's these, next year it's this group, next year it's this group, as this shift in who goes through these seasons, that's what makes the cycle change. And so it's important to understand something about the generations involved in things, and that's why you can't really tell what's going to happen. It's these turnings that make it impossible to predict. If there were no turnings, you'd have the straight line, and I could tell you where everything's going to go. But because of the turnings, it isn't a straight line. Think about history, what you know about it. In 1900, London is the capital of the world. European nations rule the whole Eastern Hemisphere with the colonial powers. There was peace, prosperity. There was world trade. There was the general consensus that wars were a thing of the past. Peace, prosperity, happy days. 1900. Now move 20 years ahead. And where are you? Well, Europe is falling apart. You'd have never in 1900 thought Europe was going to be torn apart by an Austro-Hungarian war with Russia and Germany and the Ottoman Empire gone. Just how did empires just disappear? And the Russian Empire and the Ottoman Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire were just gone. And you folks sitting here probably don't even know who those empires are, do you? I'm going to be honest. Why? Because they just disappeared. They ran the world. In 1920, communism dominated Russia. An American army had gone to Europe, 1 million men, and come home. They came home with an armistice that said Germany will never be a threat to anybody again. So let's move to 1940. 20 years. Was Germany a threat to anybody again? In 1920, the world would have said, no, look to the future. Germany is over. Didn't work that way, did it? Germany was, well, they'd conquered France, took, how long it takes to get around the Maginot Line. Conquered France, dominated Europe. One little island nation, Britain, stood against them. The newspapers in 1940 said, the war's over, Germany won, and Germany's going to dominate Europe and inherit the European empire worldwide. Come to 1960. So if you're standing in 1940, that's what you'd have thought. 1960, what's the case? What happened to Germany? Wow. Germany, they just bombed them into rubble. But who's dominating Europe? Well, the European empire around the world had collapsed. Europe is divided in the Cold War. The threat in 1960 was nuclear war. You remember building the bomb shelters in your backyard? That's 1960. In 1940, you'd have never thought about the stalemate of the Cold War, a divided. So in 1960, you look into the future, and what do you think is going to happen? Nuclear holocaust, nuclear winter, commies taking over. So you get to 1980. (1980), 1960, America reaching for the stars. 1980, what's happened to America? Little podunk third-rate nations done defeated them on the battlefield of Vietnam. America doesn't feel so confident anymore. It's in retreat. They got expelled from Iran, and Iran's holding hostages, and we can't get them back. Soviet Union is taking over. They're going to dominate the world. We're allied with Red China. Duh. You know, everybody yelling down there about Noriega in South America. He's a thug. But hello, our chief trading partner ain't no saint. So in 1980, you look to the future, and what do you say? Woo! Soviets going to clean our clock. Where's the Soviet Union today? 2000, they're gone. They don't even exist. They're gone. China. How do you explain China? Are they communist or capitalist? Yes. You know, it's the weirdest thing in the world. Now, in 2000, the world is peaceful, it's prosperous. Everything's looking up. And then September 11th, 2001. And the whole world's turned on its head. My point is, if you don't understand things aren't going to go in a straight line, they're going to turn. And you think you're going to be able to stand here, and this is where you get in this political stuff. And you say, you know, if things go like this, we got to do this. Things never have gone the way you thought they were going to go, standing here looking out, thinking they're going to be like this out there. And all you got to do is look back at 20-year intervals and see it. So you've got to have a different way of evaluating what's going on. When all else fails, read the instructions. So I think, well, if all else fails, let's go read Genesis and figure out what Genesis says. Here it is. We're going to have some seasons, and we need the seasonal thinking. Now, as I said, in economics, in political science, in geopolitics, this stuff, although it is ignored universally, the people that don't ignore it, like that guy right there, are people who look like geniuses. They're not geniuses. They're just people that have figured out what's really going on. Now, as far as ministry, I'm worried about, economics come and go. I'm thinking about the ministry. When you understand things about the ministry and about where to put yourself in ministry thing, then you're getting where we need to go. Let's talk about these cycles for a minute, because I want to get through some material here, just to give you some familiarity with what the ideas are. I can't give you a real thorough understanding of this. I would suggest to you again, get a copy of The Fourth Turning and read it. It'll give you the historical background for what we're talking about. But the first thing to grasp about this is there are 4 cycles, 4 seasons in the cycle. Now you know that from Genesis. You know there's hot and cold, summer and winter, and there's seed time and harvest. There's summer, there's winter, there's spring, and there's the fall. And the terminology that we use in that coming out of Genesis is a little different than what these guys here use, but I'm going to use some of their terminology because they describe it. When they talk about the winter section and the spring and the summer and the fall, they use some descriptive terms to describe the characteristics of those seasons. The spring over here, they call it a high. Now, you can understand something's growing and getting up high, so in the springtime, things are gonna be maturing, and you get a high. You get a growing, and this is a time when things are going to look outward, and the culture is going to be focusing on establishing some new things in it. In the summertime, in this season here, let me go back here. Cold and winter, cold and heat. These two are going to be the dominant seasons. They're the extremes, okay? And the extremes dominate things. If you have a dominant, what would these be? What's the opposite of dominant? Recessive. You okay with that? Dominant genes, recessive genes, dominant seasons, recessive. So these two are going to be the pullback reaction to what happens here. So coming out of the cold, going toward the heat, we're going to have the seed time that's going to be a high. We're going to focus outward, and this is going to be a time of outward movement. The summertime is going to be a time of awakening. A time when things develop out and come to maturity. The fall over here, they call it an unraveling. Things come apart. And the winter, they call it a crisis. That's when things die and they go away. Now, in the unraveling, if this stuff over here is outward, what would you expect the opposite of that to be? This is going to be an inward kind of a introspective kind of a season where people are thinking about, looking at kind of the inward driven kind of thing. And these steps, these phases that you go through here, you start out where things are growing, then you have things that they mature in the summertime, then they begin to decay, mature, fall apart, entropy happens here, and then there's decay and death over here so that you can replace them over here. The wintertime is a critical point. Because I made the point to you before, what you plant in the spring is what grows to maturity in the summer, is what you harvest in the fall. So what you're going to harvest in the fall is what you planted in the spring. You can't plant soybeans and go out and harvest peanuts. Now you know that, right? Please tell me yes. When you plant the soybeans, you had to decide what you were going to plant, where you were going to plant them, and when you were going to plant them. Before you planted them, that's what you're doing up here. Follow that? The most critical, exciting, dynamic, important season of the whole cycle is that one right there. Because that's the one where you get to make decisions that you execute here and you reap over here. When you're in the summer and in the fall, or even in the spring, to some extent, you are not in a season of the cycle that you can change what the harvest is going to be. It's going to be peanuts. It's going to be soybeans. It's going to be corn, based upon what you planted. Now, you can affect how much you get or how little you get, what kind of condition they're in, what you do with it. You can affect a lot of things. But there are some things you can't affect. So if you're trying to affect it, you're just beating your head against the wall and wasting time, energy, effort. The pilot called the tower and said, we're losing speed, altitude, and direction. That's not good if you're in an airplane. Okay? But we're making good time. So it's important to understand that the thing isn't going to go in the straight line. It's going to go in the cycle. And you've got to get that each cycle, each season rather, is going to be marked by a break. Now, what happens in the cycles is that between each one of these seasons in life, just like over here, there comes these rite of passages. There are going to be places in life, in the cycle of things, where there's going to be a break. And that break between one and the next is what these guys are calling, what Strauss now call a turning. That's where they get the fourth turning. That is the turning into wintertime. And when you move from one season to another, each season is going to occupy about a 20-year time period. It's not rocket science. Again, this is not exact kind of macro kind of stuff. These are approximate kind of things. Some of these cycles last 90 years, some last 70, but they'll still be divided into those four sections, and generally speaking, will run about 20 years. They come in a thing that's the way the turnings come is with what they call a catalyst, a spark, and then they have a climax. A catalyst would be some event. Now, you think about this winter, 9/11, for example. Came out of the middle of nowhere, theoretically. Not. If you knew how to think about it, you would have known it was going to happen. But with nobody thinking about it, what's the political Pat Buchanan? He wrote a book called, if you've ever read it, it's called A Republic, Not an Empire. Did you ever read that? He wrote it in the late 90s. And in that book, it's prescient. He almost predicted exactly, not the date, but the thing, the Twin Tower attack in 9/11. Why it would happen, who would do it, how they would make. And you say, well, would he have a crystal ball? No, he could foresee things happening around, going on this way. People do things. So you can kind of see the spark. Now think about, I used 9/11 because the day it happened, Fran wrote me an email, said, is this the beginning of winter? And I wrote her back, said, I'm not sure yet. We'll have to wait and see. That was the spark. You remember the complete mood change the whole nation underwent? Overnight, the whole nation, the whole world, a mood shift. You move from one. Imagine seeing the Congress standing on the steps, Democrats and Republicans, arm in arm, singing God Bless America. Wasn't that weird? And you think, could it possibly be that they would unite? Nah, they didn't. And you had two of the most divisive, the next election was, it was just, they just went right back into the soup. So the spark didn't ignite the whole thing, but the spark was the beginning. Last fall, you saw the catalyst. Because until you get somebody by the hurt, translate that money, you don't really get them. But you got their attention now, don't you? when you get caught up in politics, and some of you do this, I'm warning you. When you get so caught up in the political things and you're enamored with, you talk to people more about politics than you tell me something. How much time the last 6 months, the last 6 days have you talked about politics? Compare that with how much time you've talked to people about the Lord Jesus Christ. Now, why is it on the politics side? There isn't but one reason. It's called mammon. And the only reason you're involved in that and you're consumed by that and you think that's where your ministry ought to be is mammon. Money and what it gets. Now, I'm not against money. I'm not against you having money. I'm against it running and owning your life. Now, somebody needs to tell that to you because and I'm going to talk more about it later. I'm not going to shoot it all out now, but the evangelical, conservative, so-called world, of which grace believers immediately jump when it comes to political things, think that the answer is in that because they're worried about their possessions. Need to get out of the cold with that because that's not going to be the answer. The governmental systems, the political parties of our world are going to elect the Antichrist. All of them. If the book of Jeremiah is right, and I believe the book of Jeremiah is right. The key for us is to get unplugged from all this stuff. And not let that be, took it off. What runs the world, runs our life, and runs our ministry. But we need to understand it. Because we can be dominated by it, or we can be aware of it and stand aside from it. So you need to understand the cycles, so you know which season you're in. You need to be able to identify the cycle that you're in, and then kind of know what kind of clothes you ought to wear, what kind of life you ought to be in. Because the seasonal age in the cycle is what creates a generational archetype. And I need to put this up here so that you can kind of see this. And I'm trying to get through this stuff without it being as confusing as it is, and it isn't working. Somebody asked me something a while ago. I said, if so much of this stuff runs around in my head, and I've got so little ability to communicate it clearly that I want you to just get these pieces. There are four, in these things, there are four archetypes that Strauss and Howe, I'm going to give you this written down on a piece of paper after a while. I'm put it up here right now. And Strauss calls them, they call them the artist, the prophet, the nomad, and the hero. Now, those titles don't mean a lot to you unless you kind of get some of the idea about what's going on with it and the characteristic of them. The idea of the artist is he's an adapter. He can adapt something, change and adapt to it. The prophet is an idealist. The nomad is a realist, and the hero is civic. Now, these are the things that you want to think about when you're thinking about the archetypes, because these characteristics of each one of these generations develops as they come of age. Where they are here in the cycle, like where they are when 9/11 takes place, will determine how they react over here. So as that generational thing kind of shifts along, if you can identify where things are, and I'm going to give you a thing here in a minute that does that, then you kind of understand who's in control, what's happening, and where it goes. So it gives you the ability to look back at the seasons that have gone by. Now, when these things here match the cycle, this guy right here and this guy right here. By the way, these are the baby boomers. The silents are what we call the silents, the baby boomers, the Gen Xers, and the millennials. These are the guys being born right now that eventually will lead us into, will be the people in control when the springtime comes. These people here are moving out of midlife into eldership. These folks here are moving out of youth into midlife. These people, when they begin to take the reins, the idealist, when he's in charge, when there's a decision to make, he can't make it. If it's about money, he can't make the decision. That's why you're in the mess you're in, part of it. If it's a moral question, let me at it. So when he's in charge, you have a thing called culture wars. Now, we just went through that, didn't we? If you don't understand, when you move from fall to winter, the culture wars are over. If you think that's where you are, you're still in the last season. Our radio station here in Chicago, WYLL, back in the 90s had the most popular talk show in the Midwest, a lady by the name of Sandy Rios. And she was fabulously popular. Every congressperson, every politician and conservative politician wanted to be on because she was a right-wing conservative, anti-abortion, anti-everything, kind of thing. And she was so popular that Mrs. LaHaye hired her to come to Washington, D.C. and take over whatever that thing was, Concerned Women of America that she had. She stayed there till they closed that down. She came back to Chicago a couple years ago, started a program up again, and now can't get traction. They can't even get an audience for it hardly. Identically the same woman, message, program. You know what the problem is? It was in season, then it's out of season now. You say, well, that's because the world, America's gone to hell in a handbasket. Well, I'm not sure when it wasn't going to hell in a handbasket. I never thought the culture was any better. You know what's happened? The season's changed. I talked to the radio manager of the station when she came back on. I know these people. And I sat down with him, and I talked to him. I said, Dave, do you have any idea why Sandy's program is not going to work? He says, oh, no, it was popular. It'll work again. I said, do you have any idea why the same formula won't work now? He said, no, it's going to work. But I said, do you understand your audience has changed? He said, no. I said, I don't mean the coverage. I'm talking about the audience. Hey, folks, the things you're interested in when you're here, do your appetites and interests change when you get there? Oh, yeah. And when you move from here to here? So as long as you're in this season, you're pretty consistent. But what happens when the change from here to here for you happens? Well, your appetites. Now, some things, you like Dr. Pepper no matter what. Some things stay the same. Eternal verities. But the fact is, now I'm going to confess something. The fact is, you might move into caffeine-free diet Dr. Pepper. And you might be willing to stand and say it's almost as good as the real thing. So you go to my house and look in my garage, and you'll see that I've moved from here to here. I hope you understand what I'm saying to you. Because that radio station didn't get the idea why it didn't work, and they're still beating the drum. She's still a wonderful gal. And they have no idea, except just to throw your hands up and say, we're going down this road, and not know. Now, if they recognize the turn, could they make the show a success? Would they have to become Progressive Talk America, Air America, to make it a success? No. But they would need to talk to these people in light of them becoming these people. You follow that? That's why the turnings are important. And it's why we're going to take a break in a second, why you've got to understand we've moved out of the summer. And the things of listen, in the summers, every summer was filled with culture wars. All the things that you think nobody ever fought until the last 20 years, they fought before. In the last summer and in the summer before that. I'm going to give you a sheet in a minute. They'll have all these times. You go back and look at them and you think about what was going on in those other eras, and you'll see it. We've moved into the winter. You need to understand the change that's taking place. The fact that you're not going to stop the change to winter, but you can be prepared for it. And you can carry out your ministry in a way that can be effective because you're addressing this guy as this guy is this guy, and so forth. Not talking around me, not talking by me, but talking to me. My wife said we had to eat at 12:30, and if you want to take a 5-minute. Last night, my wife doesn't drink coffee. She made coffee last night, and Ken says, but it looks like water. She forgot to put the coffee grounds in the pot. Then in the break a while ago, she forgot to go back and check the coffee pot, and it was empty, I understand. It is now full. So if you'd like to take 5 minutes, go get you a cup of coffee. If you just can't stand it, it's back there. If you need to, by the way, there are porta potties in the back here. If you want to go down that hall, go out to the right. I warn you, though, if you go out that side door, it will shut and lock, and you can't get in it from outside. So if you go out, there's a rock there. The reason that rock is to hold the door open. That's our fancy door opener. Otherwise, you have to walk back around.